Before we descend into the frozen darkness of Alaska's most terrifying tale, welcome. If you're drawn to stories where justice takes forms beyond human understanding, where the wilderness itself becomes judge and executioner, then you've found your community. Subscribe now so you never miss a tale of terror, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, whether you're listening to this in the warmth of civilization or perhaps somewhere closer to the frozen wastes where our story takes place. Now, let the long night begin. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland like the death wail of some ancient god, carrying with it needles of ice that bit into any exposed flesh. Deputy Marshal Thomas Bridger stood at the window of the small marshal's office in Sitka, watching the darkness swallow the last traces of the afternoon sun. November in Alaska meant 3 hours of weak daylight and 21 hours of suffocating darkness. Perfect conditions for what he had planned. Sitka had grown since the United States purchased Alaska from Russia 23 years prior, but it remained a frontier outpost where law was whatever a man with a badge said it was. The town sprawled along the coast, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to cower against the elements. Russian Orthodox churches with their distinctive onion domes still dominated the skyline. Relics of the previous rulers, now serving a population of Tlingit natives, Russian holdouts, American prospectors, and the desperate souls who came north seeking fortune or escape. Thomas had come seeking neither. He'd come seeking opportunity. "Cold one tonight," said Marshal William Hendricks, settling into his chair with a groan. The older man's face was weathered like driftwood, carved by decades of hard living. He'd been marshal here for 7 years, and in that time he'd learned to ask few questions. "You taking the night patrol?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice steady and respectful. He was good at respect. At wearing the mask people expected. At 32, he cut an imposing figure tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that people often described as intense. They had no idea how right they were. Be careful out there. Prospectors been drinking heavy at the Belmont. Sometimes they get ideas about the law not applying up here. Hendricks pulled out his pipe, beginning his evening ritual. "Remember, son, we're the only thing standing between civilization and chaos in this God-forsaken territory." Thomas nodded, suppressing the smile that wanted to creep across his face. Chaos. The old man had no concept of real chaos, of what happened when the thin veneer of humanity was stripped away to reveal the beautiful violence underneath. Thomas had discovered his true nature at 17, when he'd strangled his neighbor's dog just to watch the life leave its eyes. The rush had been intoxicating, addictive. By 19, he'd graduated to people. He'd been careful over the years, moving from place to place, never staying long enough for patterns to emerge. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a railway guard, a bounty hunter, always positions where violence was expected, where bodies could be explained. But becoming a deputy marshal, that had been his masterstroke. Who would suspect the lawman? "I'll keep the peace, sir," Thomas said, pulling on his heavy coat. The bearskin-lined garment would keep him warm during the long hours ahead. He checked his Colt .45 revolver, ensuring it was loaded, then strapped on his knife, a wicked blade he'd taken from a trapper last year. The man hadn't needed it anymore. He stepped out into the night, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. His breath immediately frosted in the air, forming clouds that dissipated into the darkness. The streets of Sitka were nearly empty, just a few hardy souls hurrying between buildings, eager to escape the murderous cold. Perfect. Thomas made his way down the main thoroughfare, his boots crunching in the snow. Oil lamps flickered in windows, casting golden pools of light that barely held back the darkness. From the Belmont Saloon came the sound of rough laughter and an out-of-tune piano. The Red Dog further down contributed its own cacophony. These were the beating hearts of frontier nightlife, where men spent their gold dust on whiskey and women, trying to forget the brutal reality of life on the edge of civilization. But Thomas wasn't interested in the saloons tonight. He walked past them, heading toward the outskirts of town where the buildings became sparse, where the wilderness began to reclaim what man had tried to tame. This was where the desperate lived, the ones nobody would miss. He found her near the collapsed remains of an old Russian trading post. Anna Volkova, a prostitute who worked the lowest dives, serving the miners too poor or too drunk for the better establishments. She was perhaps 35. Though life had aged her beyond her years. When she saw his badge, she relaxed, foolish woman. "Deputy," she said in heavily accented English, her breath reeking of cheap gin. "You working late, keeping the town safe," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Cold night to be out." "Da. Yes. I go home now. Work finished." She smiled, revealing gaps in her teeth. "Let me walk you. Not safe for a woman alone." He gestured down the dark path that led to the ramshackle boarding house where she rented a room. She hesitated, some primal instinct warning her. But the badge won out. It always did. They walked together into the darkness, leaving behind the faint glow of the town's lights. They were 50 yards down the path when Thomas struck. His arm snaked around her throat, cutting off her scream before it could form. She struggled, clawing at his arm, but he was far stronger. He dragged her off the path, into the deep snow behind a stand of spruce trees. "Shh," he whispered in her ear, his voice almost tender. "Don't fight it. Fighting only makes it worse." But she did fight, and he was glad. The struggle made it better, more real. He could feel her life force, that spark of consciousness that made her human, and he wanted to watch it die. He squeezed harder, feeling her windpipe collapse under the pressure. Her struggles grew weaker, more desperate, then finally ceased altogether. He held on for another minute, making sure, then released her. She crumpled into the snow, her face purple, eyes bulging, tongue protruding. Beautiful. He knelt beside her, studying her face, memorizing every detail. This was the moment he lived for, when death transformed the living into art. But he couldn't linger. He rifled through her pockets, taking what little money she had, $3 in coins, to make it look like robbery. Then he arranged her body, making it appear she'd stumbled drunk and frozen to death. It would work. It always worked. In Alaska, death was common, enough that one more corpse would barely warrant investigation, especially when it was just a prostitute. He returned to town, resuming his patrol. No one had seen him leave with the woman. No one would connect him to her death. He was just Deputy Bridger, keeping the town safe through the long winter night. At dawn, when he returned to the marshal's office, Hendricks was already there, warming his hands by the stove. "Quiet night?" the old man asked. "Quiet as the grave," Thomas replied, and smiled. 3 days later, a trapper found Anna Volkova's body. As Thomas had predicted, Marshal Hendricks barely investigated. Drunk prostitute, frozen to death, it happened. They buried her in the small cemetery on the hill, in ground they had to thaw with fire before they could dig. 16 people attended, mostly working girls who knew they could be next. Thomas stood at the back, watching, feeling nothing but a vague satisfaction. The hunger was temporarily sated, but he knew it would return. It always did. But Alaska was proving to be everything he'd hoped: the isolation, The darkness, the harsh conditions that killed people with impunity, it was paradise for someone like him. Here, he could indulge his true nature without fear. Here, he was safe. Or so he thought. The first hint that something was wrong came 2 weeks later. Thomas was making his evening rounds when he noticed a figure standing at the edge of town, where the forest began. The figure was tall, dressed in furs, face hidden in shadow despite the moonlight that illuminated the snow. It stood perfectly still, watching him. Thomas felt a prickle of unease, an unfamiliar sensation. He was the hunter, not the hunted. He walked toward the figure, hand on his revolver. "You there," he called out. "Step into the light." The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him at all. As Thomas got closer, he could see it was a man, or what looked like a man. There was something wrong about the proportions, about the way it stood, too still, too patient. When Thomas was 20 feet away, the figure turned and walked into the forest, moving with an odd, gliding gait. Thomas pursued, plunging into the darkness between the trees, following the trail in the snow. He tracked the figure for 10 minutes, deeper into the woods, until he realized the tracks had simply stopped. In the middle of a clearing, the footprints ended, as if the person had been plucked from the earth by an invisible hand. Thomas stood in the silent forest, surrounded by ancient trees that had witnessed centuries pass, and for the first time in years, he felt fear. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but something deeper, more primal. The fear that came from realizing you might not be the apex predator you believed yourself to be. He turned back toward town, walking quickly, fighting the urge to run. Behind him, he could feel eyes watching, measuring, judging. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, full of shadows that moved with a life of their own. When he emerged back into Sitka, he was breathing hard, his heart pounding. He looked back at the tree line, but saw nothing, just darkness and snow and the eternal silence of the northern wilderness. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his small room above the marshal's office, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. Twice he heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. But when he lit a lamp and checked, no one was there. The third time he heard them, he grabbed his revolver and threw open the door, ready to confront whatever was out there. The hallway was empty, but at the far end, near the window, he saw a wet footprint, then another. They led from the window 3 stories up to his door, then stopped. The prints were too large to be human, the toes too long, too spread out. Thomas backed into his room and locked the door, knowing it was futile. If something could climb the outside wall and walk through a window, a lock wouldn't stop it. He sat in his chair, revolver in lap, and waited for dawn. It came eventually, the pale light bringing no comfort. In the morning, when he checked the hallway, the footprints were gone, if they'd ever been there at all. Marshal Hendricks noticed his deputy's haggard appearance at breakfast. "You look terrible, son. Bad dreams?" "Something like that," Thomas replied. "This place gets to everyone eventually. The darkness, the isolation. Men start seeing things, hearing things. Hell, I remember my second winter I was convinced there was something living in the walls of this office. Used to hear it scratching, moving around. Drove me half mad." "What was it?" Thomas asked. "Nothing. There was never anything there. Just the wind, the settling of old timber, and a mind playing tricks." Hendricks clapped him on the shoulder. "You need to get out more, socialize. Too much time alone isn't healthy." But Thomas knew what he'd seen wasn't his imagination. Something was out there. Something that had taken an interest in him. The question was, Why? He got his answer that evening. He was checking the cells in the back of the marshal's office. They had one prisoner, a prospector who'd gotten too enthusiastic with his fists during a card game when he heard a voice, low and rough, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. It came from the cell in the far corner, the one they never used because the back wall was partially collapsed, opening to the alley behind. Thomas approached cautiously, lamp held high. In the darkness of the cell, something moved. He could see a shape, roughly human but wrong in indefinable ways, crouched against the far wall. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, raising his revolver. The thing laughed, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen river. When it spoke, the words were in English, but the accent was unlike anything Thomas had heard ancient, predating the Russians, predating even the Tlingit. "You ask who I am? I should ask the same of you, killer. I should ask what gives you the right to take life in my territory, to spill blood on my land. Your territory? This is United States territory. I'm a deputy marshal. Your badges and borders mean nothing here. This land was old, when your people were still learning to walk upright. These forests, these mountains, they belong to those of us who came before. And you." The shape moved closer, and in the lamplight Thomas could see eyes too large, too reflective, like those of an animal. "You have violated the oldest law. Blood calls to blood. Death demands payment." "What are you?" Thomas whispered, his gun hand shaking. "I am what remains when civilization falls away. I am what waits in the spaces between your campfires. I am the price of your sins, Deputy Marshal Thomas Bridger." The thing smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too many. "You have hunted the weak, the vulnerable. Now you will learn what it means to be prey." The lamp flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Thomas fired blindly, the muzzle flash illuminating the cell for a split second. It was empty. He ran from the office into the street, gasping for air, his mind reeling. Behind him, from the darkness of the building, came that terrible laugh again, echoing and multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The prisoner, the prospector, was screaming in his cell, having witnessed whatever Thomas had seen. Marshal Hendricks came running, half-dressed, demanding to know what was happening. Thomas couldn't answer. How could he explain that something from the wilderness, something older than memory, had marked him? That his crimes hadn't gone unnoticed after all? That justice of a different kind was coming for him? I thought I saw someone in the cell." "An intruder," he managed to say. They searched the building and found nothing. The prospector, when questioned, claimed he'd seen a giant owl, or maybe a man, or maybe something in between. His mind had clearly broken from the terror. They released him the next morning, and he left town immediately, heading south, swearing he'd never return to Alaska. Thomas wanted to do the same, but pride, and something else, something darker, kept him in place. He was Thomas Bridger. He wasn't prey. He was the predator. Whatever was out there, whatever thought it could frighten him, would learn the truth. He spent the next week preparing. He acquired a Winchester rifle. Silver bullets, he'd heard the native stories about what silver could kill, and a bear trap that he set up in his room. If something came for him, he'd be ready. The showdown came on December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Thomas had learned from the Tlingit that this was when the boundary between worlds grew thin, when things that usually stayed hidden walked freely. He waited in his room, armed and alert. Around midnight, he heard. Them footsteps on the roof, then on the walls, then on the window. Not one set, but many, as if an entire crowd was gathering. The window exploded inward, and they came shapes that were almost human, almost animal, almost something else entirely. They moved like smoke and shadow, their eyes glowing with their own cold light. Thomas fired the Winchester again and again, but the bullets passed through them as if they were mist. One of them grabbed him, its hand was like ice, burning cold, and lifted him effortlessly. He could see its face now, and it was the face of Anna Volkova, frozen in her death expression, purple and swollen, but her eyes were alive, full of rage and hunger. "You thought death was the end," she whispered in his ear. "You thought you could kill without consequence, but in this land, death is just the beginning. The cold preserves everything, deputy. Every scream, every life stolen, every drop of blood spilled. It all remains, waiting." More faces appeared. Around him, victims he'd never known he had. People who died in the wilderness and been claimed by whatever ancient power dwelt in the frozen north. They reached for him with skeletal hands, their touch like frostbite. Thomas screamed, truly screamed, for the first time in his adult life. Then they released him. He fell to the floor, gasping, his skin marked with freezing burns where they'd touched him. "This is mercy," Anna's ghost said. "One chance, deputy. Leave this place. Go south, far south, where the land is warm and our reach is weak. Leave and never return. But if you stay, if you kill again on our land, we will come for you. And next time, there will be no mercy. We will take you to the deep ice, where you will freeze but never die, will suffer but never find release. Your screams will echo in the glaciers for eternity." The shapes faded, dissolving like morning mist. Thomas was left alone in his destroyed room, shivering uncontrollably, his mind struggling to process what had happened. Marshal Hendricks found him the next morning, huddled in the corner, staring at nothing. "Son, Thomas, what happened here?" Thomas looked at him, and Hendricks took a step back at what he saw in the younger man's eyes. "I'm leaving," Thomas said. "Today, south. I won't be coming back. But I can't explain. I just have to go." He packed his few belongings and was on the afternoon ship to Seattle. As the boat pulled away from Sitka's harbor, he looked back at the town, at the dark forests beyond, at the mountains that rose like ancient sentinels over the land. He never returned to Alaska. He went south as the spirits had commanded, eventually settling in California. But the hunger remained, the need to kill, to watch the light die in someone's eyes. He'd been given a reprieve, not a cure. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, he would wake to find frost on his windows, forming shapes, faces he recognized, watching, waiting, reminding him that some debts can never truly be escaped, only postponed. The thing they didn't tell him, the thing he wouldn't learn until it was too late, was that the spirits of the frozen north were patient. They could wait decades if necessary, and when someone violated their terms, when someone foolish enough thought time had made them safe, they always collected what they were owed. Thomas Bridger thought he'd escaped. For 6 months he lived in Seattle, keeping his head down, avoiding trouble. The hunger was still there, gnawing at him like a cancer, but the memory of those frozen spirits kept him in check. Every time he felt the urge rise, he remembered Anna Volkova's dead face, animated by something ancient and merciless, and he managed to restrain himself. But restraint was not in Thomas's nature, and Seattle was beginning to feel like a cage. It was June of 1891 when the telegram arrived at his boarding house. Thomas recognized the sender's name immediately. Marshal Hendricks, his old superior. From Sitka. His hands trembled as he opened it. Thomas Stop, new deputy killed. Stop need experienced. Man Stop double salary. Stop please return Stop Hendricks. Thomas read it 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. Fear the spirits had warned him never to return. Relief a reason to go back, to prove he wasn't afraid. And underneath it all, that dark excitement, the hunger awakening like a hibernating bear. He told himself he wouldn't kill again. He'd return, do his job, help Hendricks, and leave. The spirits would see he was different now, that he'd learned his lesson. It was a lie, and some part of him knew it. But humans are skilled at self-deception. 3 weeks later, Thomas stepped off the steamer, back into Sitka, and the moment his boots touched the dock, he felt it a presence, vast and old, becoming aware of him. The town looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. The shadows seemed darker, more alive. The mountains loomed with deliberate menace. Marshal Hendricks met him at the dock, and Thomas was shocked by how much the man had aged. His hair had gone completely white, and he moved like someone much older than his 56 years. Thomas, Hendricks gripped his hand firmly. Thank God you came. I didn't know who else to trust. What happened to Deputy Morrison? Found him in his room 3 weeks ago, frozen solid, despite it being June and his stove burning hot. Door locked from inside, no signs of forced entry. Hendricks lowered his voice. His face, Thomas. He died, terrified. Never seen anything like it. Doctor said it was medically impossible, but there he was, frozen like a January corpse in the middle of summer. Thomas felt ice water in his veins. The spirits. They'd killed Morrison to create an opening, to lure him back. This was a trap. Maybe I shouldn't have come, Thomas said. Nonsense. You're exactly what we need. Crime's gotten worse since you left. 2 more prostitutes killed, both strangled, left in the woods. 3 prospectors vanished without a trace. Something's wrong in this town, Thomas. Something evil. Thomas said nothing, processing this information. 2 prostitutes strangled. His method. Had the spirits been killing people using his pattern? Or had someone else taken up where he'd left off? They walked to the marshal's office, and Thomas felt eyes watching from every shadow, every darkened window. The Tlingit people they passed looked at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Recognition? Warning? Fear? An old native woman, her face mapped with wrinkles, stepped directly into his path. She spoke in rapid Tlingit, her tone urgent, almost pleading. Thomas didn't understand the words, but her meaning was clear. Leave. Go now. Before it's too late. Hendricks, shoot her away. Don't mind them. They've been skittish since Morrison died, talking about curses and spirits and God knows what else. Superstitious nonsense. But Thomas knew better. It wasn't nonsense. It was a warning. He spent his first day back getting reacquainted with the town. Sitka had grown slightly. A few new buildings. More prospectors flooding in following rumors of gold strikes to the north. But the essential character remained a frontier town, balanced on the knife edge between civilization and wilderness, where the rule of law was maintained by men with badges and guns, and where the true power belonged to the ancient land itself. That night, alone in his room, the same room where the spirits had confronted him before Thomas lay awake, listening. Around 2 in the morning he heard it. Footsteps on the roof. slow and deliberate, back and forth, back and forth. Then scratching at the walls, at the window, soft but insistent. "I'm not afraid of you," Thomas whispered to the darkness. The scratching stopped. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, Anna Volkova spoke. "You should be." The temperature in the room plummeted. Thomas could see his breath, watch frost crawl across the window like living fingers. The floorboards creaked under weight that wasn't there. "You were warned," the voice continued. "You were given mercy, and you returned. I'm here to do a job. I won't kill anyone. I'll leave as soon as Hendricks finds a permanent replacement." Laughter, cold and cruel. "Do you think we care about your intentions? You are a killer, Thomas Bridger. It's what you are, and soon you will kill again. You can't help yourself. I can control it. We shall see." The cold vanished as suddenly as it had come. Thomas was alone again, but sleep was impossible. He sat up the rest of the night, revolver in hand, watching the shadows. The next morning, a body was found. Sarah Collins, daughter of the town's Presbyterian minister, 16 years old, strangled and left in the snow behind the Russian Orthodox Church. Her body bore the marks Thomas knew intimately, the bruising pattern of strong hands. Around the throat, the way the killer had held on, well past death. The careful positioning of the corpse. It was his work, his style. But he hadn't done it. Marshall Hendricks was devastated. She was a good girl. Helped her father with the mission, taught reading to the native children. Who would do this? Thomas examined the body, his trained eye noting every detail. The method was his, but the execution was slightly off. The grip had been too wide, the pressure uneven. And there was something else. The body was cold, far colder than it should be given the summer temperature and the short time since death. The other two murders, Thomas said, were they like this? Exactly like this, Hendricks confirmed. All young women, all strangled, all found in the snow despite it being summer. Show me where the others were found. Hendricks took him to the locations. The first was near the old Russian trading post where Thomas had killed Anna Volkova. The second was in a clearing that Thomas had scouted months ago, planning a kill he never committed. And now Sarah Collins, behind the church, another spot Thomas had mentally cataloged. The spirits were recreating his crimes. They were showing him what he'd done, forcing him to investigate his own pattern. But why? What did they want? He got his answer that evening. Thomas was walking the night patrol, his mind churning through possibilities, when he saw a figure ahead, a woman in a white dress, blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She stood under a street lamp, and even from a distance, Thomas could tell something was wrong. No one stood that still, that perfectly motionless. As he approached, the woman turned to face him. It was Sarah Collins, her neck marked with the bruises that had killed her, her skin the blue-white of a corpse. But her eyes were alive, burning with that familiar cold fire. "Hello, deputy," she said in a voice that wasn't quite hers. "Do you like our gift?" "What are you doing?" Thomas demanded. "Why are you killing these women?" "We're not killing them. You are. I haven't touched anyone. Haven't you?" The Sarathang smiled. "Every death in this town, every drop of blood spilled, it all flows from you. You brought murder here. You showed the darkness what was possible. We are merely continuing your work." "That's insane." "Is it? You awakened something in this place, Thomas Bridger. Your violence, your joy in killing, it fed something that had been sleeping for centuries. an old power, older than the Tlingit, older than the Russians, older than any human settlement. It feeds on death, on fear, on suffering. And you, with your careful murders, your hidden crimes, you gave it exactly what it needed to grow strong again. Thomas felt sick. I don't believe you. Then believe this. We will continue killing in your style, using your methods, until this entire town is dead. Unless what? Unless you stop us. How? You know how. You've always known. The only way to end the killing is for the killer to face justice. Real justice, not the mockery you've avoided all your life. Sarah's corpse collapsed into the snow, suddenly just a dead body again. Thomas stood over it, his mind reeling. The spirits wanted him to confess, to turn himself in, to accept punishment for his crimes, but that was impossible. They'd hang him, and for what? For deaths that happened far away, in different territories, where no one even knew to look for a killer? He couldn't do it, wouldn't do it. But that night, as he lay in his bed, he heard the screaming. It came from the direction of the Red Dog Saloon, high and terrified, and abruptly cut short. He dressed and ran, joining the crowd that had gathered outside the establishment. Inside, they found two more bodies. Emily Morrison, wife of the dead deputy, and her sister, Grace. Both strangled, both marked with Thomas's signature method, and carved into the wooden floor beneath them in letters that looked burned rather than cut. This is your doing, Bridger. What does that mean? Hendricks asked, staring at the message. Why would it say your name? Thomas couldn't answer. Around him, the townspeople were muttering, casting suspicious glances his way. The seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next week, 3 more people died, all strangled, all bearing Thomas's methods, all with messages blaming him. The town was descending into panic. Vigilante groups formed, arguing about who the killer might be. Thomas's name came up more and more often. You have to admit, it's suspicious, said James Cooper, one of the prospectors. Morrison dies mysteriously. Thomas returns, and suddenly, murders start happening. Murders that are identical to a pattern he'd have learned as a lawman. Thomas Bridger is a deputy marshal. Hendricks defended him, but even the old marshal's voice held doubt now. He's helped solve crimes, not commit them. Then, where was he when each murder happened? Thomas had alibis for most of them, but not all. There were gaps, times when he'd been alone on patrol, times when he couldn't prove his whereabouts. The net was tightening, carefully constructed by forces that understood human nature all too well. On the 8th day after his return, Thomas found a note slipped under his door. It was written in a childish scrawl, in ink that looked disturbingly like dried blood. We will kill everyone in this town. Every man, woman, and child will die in your name. Their blood will be on your hands, unless you confess, unless you face what you've done. You have until the next full moon, 3 nights. Choose quickly, deputy. Choose wisely. Thomas crumpled the note, his hands shaking with rage and fear. This was impossible. They were backing him into a corner, forcing him to either confess to crimes he'd committed hundreds of miles away or watch innocent people die in his place. But Thomas Bridger was a survivor. He'd escaped justice for 15 years. He wasn't going to surrender now. If the spirits wanted a confession, he'd give them one. Just not his own. He spent the next 2 days investigating, looking for anyone in Sitka who might have killed before, anyone he could frame for the murders. He found several candidates, prospectors with violent pasts, sailors who'd jumped ship and were likely running from crimes elsewhere, even a Russian traitor who'd been accused of murder in his homeland. Thomas chose the Russian, Viktor Sokolov, a man with no family, no friends, and a reputation for violence. It was almost too easy to plant evidence: a scarf belonging to one of the victims in Viktor's room, scratches on his hands that could have come from a struggle. Thomas even forged a confession note, crude but convincing. On the morning of the 9th day, Thomas and Hendricks arrested Viktor. The Russian protested his innocence in broken English, but the evidence was damning. A quick trial was held. Frontier justice didn't require lengthy proceedings, and Viktor was sentenced to hang. The execution was scheduled for noon the next day, one night before the full moon deadline. Thomas watched the preparations with satisfaction. He'd beaten them. He'd found a way out. That night, Viktor Sokolov hanged himself in his cell, unable to face the noose. His body was discovered at dawn, swinging from a belt attached to the cell bars. Marshal Hendricks sighed with relief. Well, that's that. Justice served, even if by his own hand. Town can rest easy now. But Thomas knew better. This wasn't over. The full moon rose that night, huge and yellow, like a diseased eye staring down at the town. Thomas stood at his window, watching it climb the sky, waiting for what he knew was coming. At midnight, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in as many seconds. Frost covered every surface, ice formed on standing water, and breath became visible fog. The entire town of Sitka was plunged into midwinter cold, despite it being July. Thomas heard them before he saw them, voices, hundreds of them, speaking in unison. The language was ancient, pre-human, words that hurt to hear. Every person in town heard it, waking from sleep, emerging from saloons and homes to witness what was coming. They rose from the earth itself, from the snow that had appeared impossibly on the ground. All the victims. Anna Volkova and the others Thomas had killed in Sitka, yes, but more, so many more. Every person he'd murdered across his 15-year career, somehow found, somehow awakened, somehow brought here, to this place. They walked through the streets like a silent army, their dead eyes fixed on the marshal's office, on the window where Thomas stood frozen in horror. Marshal Hendricks ran to Thomas's room. "What is this? What's happening?" Thomas couldn't answer. His crimes, every single one, were manifest before him. There was no denying it now, no escaping it. The spirits surrounded the building. When they spoke, it was with one voice, thunderous and final. "Thomas Bridger, you were given mercy. You returned. You killed again through us, yes, but the violence was yours. The pattern was yours. The guilt is yours. You framed an innocent man. You chose violence over justice. You chose death over life. Now you will face the consequence." "Wait!" Thomas shouted. "Viktor wasn't innocent. He'd killed before back in Russia. I checked." "He deserved. No one deserves what you've done, what you do, what you are." The spirits began to advance, climbing the walls, seeping through the windows like freezing mist. Hendricks was screaming, demanding explanations, but Thomas wasn't listening. He was watching his victims come for him, watching justice reel, final justice approach with the inevitability of winter. In desperation, Thomas grabbed his revolver and put the barrel under his chin. If he killed himself, at least he'd die on his own terms. But his finger wouldn't pull the trigger. His hand wouldn't obey. The spirits were inside him now, Cold as absolute zero, taking control. You don't get to choose, they said through his mouth. You don't get the easy way out. They forced him to walk downstairs, past the terrified Hendricks, out into the street where the entire town had gathered. Against his will, his mouth opened, and the truth poured out every murder, every victim, every detail of 15 years of killing. He confessed it all while his victims stood as witnesses, their presence confirmation of his crimes. The townspeople listened in growing horror. When Thomas's forced confession ended, silence fell over Sitka, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant crash of waves. "Hang him," someone said. "No," said the spirits, still controlling Thomas's body. "Hanging is too quick, too merciful. He will face the old justice, the cold justice, the justice of the land he violated." They marched him out of town, the entire population following, unable to look away. They walked into the wilderness, into the ancient forest, until they reached a place where the trees grew so thick that even in summer, snow remained on the ground year-round. There, in a clearing lit by the diseased moon, stood a glacier, a river of ancient ice, blue-green and impossibly old. The spirits led Thomas to a crevasse in its face, a wound in the ice that went down into darkness. "This is your prison," they said. "Here you will freeze but never die. Here you will feel every moment of suffering you inflicted on others. Here you will remain until the ice itself melts, until the earth is renewed, until your debt is paid." They released his body then, and Thomas tried to run, but the other spirits, his victims, grabbed him with frozen hands. They pulled him toward the crevasse, and he fought, screaming, begging for mercy he'd never shown. They threw him into the ice. Thomas fell into blue darkness, the cold so intense it burned. He hit the bottom of the crevasse, except there was no bottom, just more falling, down into the heart of the glacier, into ice that had been forming since before humans walked the earth. And then he stopped, suspended in the ancient ice, frozen, solid, but still conscious, still aware. He could see, somehow, through the blue-white ice around him. He could feel everything, the cold, the pressure, the absolute isolation. But he couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't die. The townspeople stood at the edge of the glacier, watching the ice where Thomas had vanished. Marshal Hendricks wept, whether from betrayal or pity, no one could say. The spirits faded as the sun rose, returning to wherever they dwelled when not called forth. The unnatural cold lifted, and summer returned to Sitka. But something had changed. The town felt cleaner, lighter, as if a poisonous presence had been removed. Viktor Sokolov's name was cleared posthumously. The truth of his innocence, at least of these crimes, was acknowledged, and he was buried with apologies. And in the glacier, Thomas Bridger remained, conscious and frozen, living every second of eternity. On cold winter nights, some claimed they could hear screaming from deep within the ice. The Tlingit people said it was the sound of evil being purified, justice being served in the old way. Years would pass, then decades, then centuries. The glacier would flow slowly toward the sea, carrying its prisoner with it, and Thomas would remain aware through it all, experiencing every moment, feeling the weight of his crimes in a way no mortal punishment could achieve. Some said it was too harsh. Others said it was exactly what he deserved. But all agreed on one thing. Sitka was safer with Thomas Bridger gone, trapped in his prison of ice, serving a sentence that would last until the world itself ended. The story became legend. told in whispers, passed down through generations. A warning about the price of violence, about the justice that waits in wild places for those who believe they're above the law. And deep in the ice, Thomas Bridger had an eternity to reflect on his choices, his victims, and the frozen hell he'd earned for himself. The 15th of July 2025. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the newly exposed ice field, her breath misting in the unseasonable cold. The climate crisis had accelerated glacial melt across Alaska, revealing landscapes that hadn't seen sunlight in millennia. As a forensic anthropologist, she'd been called to sites like this before ancient human remains were emerging from the ice with increasing frequency. But this find was different. "It's about 40 meters in," said Marcus Webb, the park ranger who discovered it. "I was documenting the melt line when I saw something in the ice. At first, I thought it was just a weird formation, but then I got closer and saw. Well, you'll see." They walked across the treacherous surface, Sarah's crampons biting into the ice with each pressed step. The glacier was dying. That much was obvious. Streams of meltwater carved channels through its surface, and the groaning sounds it made were almost alive, almost mournful. "There," Marcus pointed. Sarah saw it and stopped dead. Encased in a wall of blue ice, perfectly preserved, was a man. He was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a scream, hands clawed upward as if trying to escape. His clothing was clearly from another era, late 19th century, she estimated, but it was his eyes that made her skin crawl. They weren't closed, weren't dead. They looked aware. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Eyes don't remain open like that. The freeze would have—" "I know," Marcus interrupted. "But look at them. Really look." She did, using her flashlight to peer through the ice. And she saw it. The slightest movement, a microscopic shift, as if the eyes were tracking the light. "It's just refraction," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Ice can create optical illusions." They spent the next hour documenting the find, taking measurements, photos, samples of the surrounding ice. Sarah tried to maintain professional detachment, but something about the frozen man disturbed her on a primal level. He looked like he was still suffering, still experiencing the moment of his death. "We need to extract him," she finally decided. "Get him to the lab for proper analysis." This could be an incredible historical find, possibly a prospector from the Gold Rush era. The extraction took 3 days. They cut a massive block of ice containing the body and airlifted it to the research facility in Juneau. Throughout the process, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the frozen man was watching her, that those impossible eyes were following her movements. At the lab, they began the careful process of thawing the ice. Sarah's team worked in shifts, meticulously controlling the temperature, documenting every stage of the thaw. The body was in remarkable condition. No ice crystals had formed in the tissues, no freezer burn, nothing that would normally occur with a 1, 3, 5-year-old frozen corpse. On the third night of the thaw, Sarah was alone in the lab, reviewing scans, when the temperature suddenly dropped. Her breath became visible, and the monitors showed the room had gone from 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 32 inches less than a minute. She looked at the ice block containing the body. The eyes were open, and they were definitely looking at her now. "Hello, doctor," said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. Sarah spun around, but the lab was empty. Just her and the frozen man. "I know you can hear me," the voice continued, dry and cracked, like something that hadn't spoken in a very long time. "I can see you. I've been seeing you for days now. Do you know how long it's been since I've seen a living face? This isn't happening, Sarah said, backing toward the door. 134 years, 6 months, and 9 days, the voice said. That's how long I've been in the ice. Conscious, aware, suffering. Do you understand what that means, Doctor? Do you understand what that kind of time does to a mind? The ice around the body began to crack, thin fractures spreading across its surface. Sarah hit the emergency alarm, but nothing happened. The power was out, killed by the impossible cold. They put me here, the voice said. The spirits of the land, the ghosts of my victims. They said I would remain until the ice melted. Well, Doctor, the ice is melting. My sentence is almost served. Who are you? Sarah managed to ask. My name is Thomas Bridger. I was a deputy marshal in Sitka. I was also a murderer. I killed 23 people over 15 years. The spirits gave me a choice, confess and hang, or spend eternity in the ice. I chose neither, and they chose for me. The ice was melting rapidly now, water pooling on the lab floor. Sarah could see the body starting to move, fingers twitching, chest beginning to rise and fall, with breath that shouldn't be possible. I've had a long time to think, Doctor. A long time to feel every second of suffering I inflicted on others. They thought it would purify me, change me, make me understand the enormity of my crimes. The voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. They were wrong. It just made me angry. Angrier than you can possibly imagine. The ice shattered. Thomas Bridger sat up, water streaming from his 19th century clothing, his skin impossibly preserved. He looked exactly as he had the day he'd been thrown into the glacier except for his eyes. They were old, ancient, filled with the madness of a century and a half of conscious imprisonment. I'm free, he said, his voice, his own now, speaking with his physical mouth. The sentence is served, the debt is paid, and now. He stood and Sarah ran. She burst through the lab doors into the hallway, screaming for help. Behind her, she heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, the walk of someone savoring their first moments of freedom. Security arrived within minutes, but they found the lab empty. The ice block was there, completely melted, but no body, just pools of water and Sarah Chen, hysterical, babbling about a frozen man who'd come back to life. They sedated her, sent her home, recommended counseling. The official report stated that the stress of the extraction had caused a psychotic episode. The body, they claimed, had never been properly secured. It must have been damaged during transport, melted too quickly, been disposed of by mistake. But Sarah knew the truth. Thomas Bridger was alive, free, and somewhere in Alaska. The killings started 2 weeks later. The first victim was Marcus Webb, the park ranger who discovered the glacier body. He was found in his home, strangled, positioned in a way that seemed deliberately archaic. The police noted that it resembled strangulation techniques from the late 1800s. Then came Dr. James Morrison, the lab technician who'd helped with the ice extraction. Strangled, left in the snow even though it was summer. Sarah knew she was next. She tried to warn people, but who would believe her? A man frozen for 134 years, brought back to life by climate change? It sounded insane even to her. She did her own research instead, digging through historical archives, searching for any information about Thomas Bridger. She found his record deputy marshal in Sitka disappeared in July 1891. There was a newspaper article from the time, vague and cryptic, mentioning frontier justice and old ways, but nothing definite. Then she found a diary, written by a Tlingit elder in 1891, translated and archived by the University of Alaska. It told the story, the murders, the spirits, the judgment, and the imprisonment in ice. It also mentioned something Sarah had missed. The white man's sentence will last until the ice melts. Then he will be free to return to the world. But the man's sentence, spirits warned, if he returns unchanged, if he still carries murder in his heart, he will face a final judgment. This time, there will be no mercy, no second chance. He will be erased, not just killed, but unmade, removed from existence as if he never was. Final judgment. That was the key. The spirits hadn't just frozen him as punishment, they'd given him time to change. If he emerged still, wanting to kill, still embracing his dark nature, they would destroy him utterly. Sarah had to find Thomas before he killed again. Not to save him, he deserved whatever the spirits had planned, but to end this before more innocent people died. She found him in Sitka. Of course he'd return to Sitka. It was where his story had started, where his crimes had caught up with him. The town had changed dramatically. Modern buildings, paved roads, internet cafes, and coffee shops where saloons used to stand. But the wilderness beyond remained eternal, unchanged by human progress. Thomas was, standing in what used to be the town cemetery, now partially converted into a historical site. He was reading headstones, recognizing names from his era, seeing how much time had passed. "Thomas Bridger," Sarah called out. He turned, and she could see the madness in his eyes, the weight of impossible years pressing down on him. "Dr. Chen, I knew you'd come. You're a survivor, like me. You understand. I understand that you're a killer, that you haven't changed." "Changed?" He laughed. "How could I change? I spent 134 years frozen, conscious, unable to even close my eyes. Do you know what that does to a person? The spirits thought they were punishing me, purifying me, but all they did was distill me down to my essence. And my essence, doctor, is death. Then the spirits will destroy you." The diary said. I know what the diary said. I know about the final judgment, but I don't care anymore. I've suffered for more than a century. If they want to erase me, let them. But first, I'm going to do what I was made to do, what I'm good at. He moved toward her, and Sarah realized she'd made a terrible mistake coming here alone. But before he could reach her, the temperature dropped. That same impossible cold she'd felt in the lab, but stronger, more intense. The spirits had arrived. They manifested from the ground itself, from the trees, from the very air. Hundreds of them, thousands, all the victims of violence across Alaska's history. But at their head were the 23 Thomas's victims, led by Anna Volkova. Thomas Bridger. They spoke in unison, their voice like thunder. You were given a century to reflect, a century to change, a century to understand the weight of your crimes. Have you learned nothing? I've learned that suffering doesn't ennoble, Thomas said. It doesn't redeem. It just makes you harder, colder, more yourself. You wanted to change me? You should have killed me. We gave you more mercy than you gave any of your victims. And I'm supposed to be grateful? I spent 134 years in frozen hell. I felt every second of it. You call that mercy? Yes, said Anna, stepping forward from the host. Because we could have made it eternal. Because we could have made it worse. Because despite everything you'd done, we honored the laws of the land. Punishment that ends. Justice that allows for redemption. You chose to remain what you are. Then do what you came to do, Thomas said. Erase me. I'm not afraid anymore. It's not that simple, Anna said. You have to choose. One final choice. You can accept what you are, embrace it fully, and we will indeed unmake you. Not just kill you, but remove you from existence entirely. Every life you touched will forget you. Every record will vanish. You will have never been. Or, Thomas asked, or you can choose atonement, real atonement. You go back into the ice, but this time not frozen and aware. This time sleeping, dreaming, experiencing the lives of your victims, living their joy, feeling their pain, understanding what you took from the world. When the ice fully melts, perhaps another century, perhaps less, you'll emerge again. If you've truly learned, truly changed, you'll be free. If not, then we'll unmake you. Thomas looked at Sarah, then at the assembled spirits, then at the modern world around him, a world he no longer understood, no longer fit into. You're asking me to choose between oblivion and torture. We're asking you to choose between ending and becoming, Anna corrected, between staying what you are and possibly becoming something better. The torture, Thomas, is what you've been carrying all along. We're offering you a chance to put it down. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Sarah watched him, seeing the war playing out behind his eyes. The hunger to kill, to feel that rush one more time. The weariness of suffering for so long. The faint, almost invisible spark of something that might have been his humanity buried deep beneath layers of violence and madness. If I go back, he said slowly, if I choose the ice again, will I remember? When I come out, will I remember being Thomas Bridger the killer? You'll remember everything, Anna said, but you'll also understand it differently. You'll see through our eyes, feel with our hearts. You'll know what it was like to be us. Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. I'm so tired, he whispered. I'm so tired of being this. I don't know if I can change. I don't know if there's anything in me worth saving. But I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of the hunger. I'm tired of being alone with what I've done. Then choose, Anna said gently. Choose to try. Thomas looked at Sarah one last time. I'm sorry, he said, for what I did to Marcus and James, for scaring you, for everything. Then he turned to the spirits. Take me back. Let me try. The spirits moved as one, surrounding him, lifting him. The cold intensified, and snow began to fall despite it being summer. They carried him away from the cemetery, into the wilderness, toward the mountains, where the glaciers still clung to existence. Sarah followed at a distance, compelled to witness the end of the story. They took him to a different glacier than before, one deeper in the mountains, one that might last another 100 years if the climate models were wrong, longer if they were lucky. They laid him on the ice, and he didn't resist. Anna knelt beside him, placing a frozen hand on his forehead. Sleep now, she said. Dream of us. Live what we lived. Feel what we felt. And when you wake, if you wake, perhaps you'll be someone different. Perhaps you'll be someone who deserves a second chance. The ice opened beneath him, not a crevasse this time, but something more gentle, like the earth welcoming him back. He sank into it, and the ice closed over him. But this time, his eyes were closed, his face peaceful. This time, he was sleeping, not suffering. The spirits faded with the snow, and summer returned. Sarah stood alone in the wilderness, watching the place where Thomas Bridger had been taken. She returned to Juneau, wrote her report, and included everything: the frozen man, the resurrection, the spirits, the final judgment. Her superiors thought she'd had a breakdown, and she was quietly removed from active duty. But she didn't care. She knew what she'd seen. She knew the truth. And sometimes, on cold nights, she thought about Thomas Bridger sleeping in the ice, dreaming of the lives he'd taken. Maybe, just maybe, learning to be human. March 2157. The last glacier in what used to be called Alaska melted on a Tuesday. Climate restoration efforts had come too late to save them, but the Earth was healing, slowly becoming habitable again. A team of researchers was documenting the final melt when they found him, a man in 19th century clothing, perfectly preserved, sleeping peacefully in the ice. His face was calm, almost serene. They extracted him carefully, reverently. In his pocket, they found a journal, somehow preserved, written in archaic English. It was filled with entries, thousands of them, each one a memory, a life, a story of someone else. As the ice around him melted, his eyes opened, but they were different now, softer, filled not with madness, but with a deep, profound sadness and understanding. How long? He asked in English that sounded centuries old. 132 years since the glacier formed, the lead researcher said. You've been here since the early 2000s, according to our dating. Thomas Bridger, though he barely felt like Thomas anymore, barely remembered being him, sat up and looked at the world. It was nothing like the one he'd left, nothing like he could have imagined, but it was beautiful in ways he could finally appreciate. I'm free? He asked. You're free, confirmed a voice that only he could hear. Anna's voice, faint but present. You've learned. You've changed. Your debt is paid. What you do with this freedom is up to you now. Thomas stood on shaking legs, looking at his hands, at the impossible future around him, at the second chance he'd earned through dreams and suffering, and finally understanding. Thank you, he whispered, to ghosts only he could see. And then he walked forward into a world that had moved on without him, carrying the weight of his crimes, but also the weight of his victims' lives, their joys, their loves, their humanity. He would spend the rest of his days atoning, not because he had to, but because he finally understood why he should. The spirits watched him go, satisfied at last. Justice had been served, not the quick justice of execution, not the eternal justice of damnation, but the hardest justice of all, the justice of transformation, of a monster learning to be a man. And in the place where the glacier had been, the land began to heal. And so ends the tale of Thomas Bridger, the frozen deputy whose crimes echoed across centuries, a monster who became a man, but only after paying a price measured in lifetimes. What do you think? Was his punishment too harsh, or exactly what he deserved? Could someone who committed such terrible acts truly change? Or are some souls beyond redemption? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this 3-part journey into Alaska's darkest corners, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of terror. Next time, We'll explore another dark chapter of history where the dead don't rest easy and justice wears a face you won't expect. Until then, stay warm. And remember, some debts take longer than a lifetime to pay. Sweet dreams.